if instead of bailing out the financial system, which had caused this crisis, the mortgagers had been bailed out, the amount of bailout required would have been substantially less, in the billions instead of in the trillions. And also, the Great Recession, which followed, would have been averted. But this theory was not adopted because it did not favor the interests of the rich. And so, what happened in history was that there was this battle of two theories, and the theory which won was not the right theory, but the theory which won was the one which was used in conducting policy, and therefore that theory prevailed and it shaped the policy response. We try to understand history, we try to shape history by the way of theories. Our theories then shape history, and history shapes the theories. So this is the what I call entanglement.
Welcome to Activist MMT, a podcast about real-world economics, including modern money theory, and how life changes when you discover it. I'm your host, Jeff Epstein. Today's part 2 of my two-part conversation with Asad Zaman on the 2001 edition of Karl Polanyi's 1944 book, The Great Transformation. This is also the final part in a larger 4-part series on the book. Parts 1 and 2 are with Jackson Winter. Jackson and I are two smart layperson MMTers trying to come to terms with the depth of what we just read and connecting it to our lives and MMT. Parts 3 and 4 are with Professor Zaman, who is a PhD economist with many lectures, papers, and posts on the topic, all of which you can find in the show notes to Part 1 with Professor Zaman. Part 1 also contains a summary of the book. You think you understand the foundation of our economy and society, but as described in The Great Transformation, there's another foundation beneath it. If you like what you hear, then I hope you might consider becoming a monthly patron of Activist MMT. Patrons have exclusive access to several full-length episodes right now. Patrons also get the opportunity to ask my academic guests questions, including my recent episode with Warren Mosler. They also support the development of my large and growing collection of Learn MMT resources and the course with Professor Zaman. To become a patron, you can start by going to patreon.com/activistmmt. Every little bit helps a little bit, and it all adds up to a lot. Thanks. And now, let's get right back to my conversation with Asad Zaman. Enjoy.
Idea of nations. Say, let us think of the world as one human, as humanity, and ask what kind of trading system would benefit the masses. We would come up with a radically different type of trade.
Can you address briefly how mercantilism fits into this?
Yes, mercantilism was an early. Basically, if you look at economic theories, you see that as the system was evolving, the theories were co-evolving with the system. So basically, when we talk about the gold standard for a century, that is just the mercantilism basically focused on acquiring gold. And how can you do that? By selling goods to the other countries. But mercantilism period was a period of where you wanted money to conduct wars, whether it was with other states or whether it was colonizing wars, but you needed gold to pay your soldiers and to build your industrial products. and to import the things that were essential for your industry, like raw materials, etc. So basically, gold was needed for wars. But this war was an expensive way to acquire resources of other countries. And after colonization took place, then you could do that by monetary methods. And today, after the world wars, basically the financial system is able to extract revenue from all of the world without in very peaceful ways. Like, for example, they have entrapped the US students in $1 trillion debt. And so they will be working their jobs and paying off for the corporations, basically, because corporations will extract their tithe in terms of the interest payments on the loans that they have been given for the study. Whereas the society itself could have arranged for this education on a cooperative basis simply by reorganizing the structure of rights. If we live in a society where every student is entitled to education as a human right, then they wouldn't have to pay for it. I mean, it's the collective responsibility of the society to pay for the education of all the children living in our society. This simple ideological attitude would change the world.
Can you address how mercantilism, although it was not great for average people, that at the time and given the context of the world at the time, that mercantilism was an appropriate policy?
Yeah, basically, when Adam Smith wrote, mercantilism was the dominant economic theory, and basically, Adam Smith is the transition point from mercantilism to free trade. And before Adam Smith, the nations were competing with each other on the battleground. And so for that, book is about basically the how the states can acquire power. And power involves getting gold, and all of the theories, the mercantilist theories, are basically designed to say practical advice on nations on how to acquire economic power. But the nature of economic power changed as the system developed, and you could get more power by trading with the enemy than by battling them. And so the economic system changed in that direction.
Okay. All right. My next question, I think, is the least well formed, but I think it is certainly enough to get you to understand what I'm talking about. Okay. Fascism. Fascism is not a powerful movement in and of itself. Rather, it's something that fills in the vacuum caused by the suffering of the self-regulating market. So he talks about close to the end of the book, he talks about, maybe it's even in the notes, but he talks about how in history, when the suffering was great because of a self-regulating market, that's when fascism rises. And that when that suffering is reduced, fascism disappears. So fascism is not something in and of itself, in a sense, but rather something that is just always standing at the ready to fill in the vacuum of the damage caused by the self-regulating market.
Yeah, here my grasp on history of this phenomena is not very strong. So I just read Polanyi on it, and that's all I know. And basically, what you have said is a good summary, that when the self-regulating market causes too much suffering, then a leader emerges who enforces his will on the people, and people are ready to march to any tune to save themselves from the suffering of the market. And viewed in this light, USA is ripe for fascism today. And in fact, you can see that in Trump, because the suffering being caused to the people by the market is just increasing massively, and the standards of living have been declining, and lives have become more and more miserable over the past 3 decades, ever since the Reagan-Thatcher revolution, basically. The labor class hasn't made any progress, while the capitalists have captured all of the gains from economic growth. So there is a so-called economic puzzle of productivity, that the productivity of laborers has been going up steadily, but their real wage has remained more or less constant. So people are very puzzled as to how that happens, because they don't, in neoclassical, they don't take into account power of the different classes.
Okay, all right. So next one. According to Adam Smith in 1775, man has a natural tendency to barter, to accumulate material things. Essentially, humans have an inherent and internal motivation to be greedy, and that all of society's problems can be solved with more greed, with more stuff. So history reveals that these things are not true. The real motivations for obtaining material wealth is as a tool to increase social standing. But in order to perpetuate this ideology of greed, it requires that we ignore history, any history that happens to show that greed is not natural, that wanting to trade and barter is not natural. It requires that we denigrate those who aren't greedy as uncivilized and primitive, and these things justify ignoring their history and crushing anyone who stands in the way of our greed. And more broadly, it justifies cruelty and discrimination against the poor, which is commodification of the poor, requiring a labor market. And Margaret Thatcher's dictum that there is no alternative, Tina,
Yes.
was basically her proclamation that the self-regulating market and that, austerity and that we must hurt the poor is unfortunate but necessary, and the debate is over. And you pointed out something, or I don't think the book did, but you did, that in Jane Austen novels, that the quote, the poor
Yes.
are not the poor.
Yes.
They're the poorest among the aristocracy, the ones who are struggling to hold on to their land, that have land at all.
Exactly.
And that those in true poverty are never even mentioned. So
that's right.
So that death to the actual poor is actual death, but death to those in the poor in the Jane Austen novels, is becoming those invisible people, is becoming part of the actual poor, and essentially being considered worthless and invisible to the aristocracy. So please.
Yes, Jane, well, this is not original with me. A lot of people have discussed this aspect of Jane Austen and even her awareness of colonization. But basically, yes, even the main struggle between the protagonists, who is it? Elizabeth, I think, is the lead. And she is not respectable in the eyes of Darcy initially, because their family is poor, and she is struggling to maintain that she is equal, because we are gentlemen and you are gentlemen, and so we have equal status. So, but anyone beneath her would be just not part of the human beings. They don't have blue blood. I mean, basically, that's there is the aristocratic class, and the others are non-human beings. And basically, if you look at the Tale of Two Cities, that's what it starts out with, that an aristocrat is racing through the streets of Paris, and his carriage crushes a child. And so he stops and tosses a few gold coins to the family and continues on his merry way. And that led to the French Revolution. I mean, that was one of the sparks, I guess. I mean, it's not that particular instance, that's a fiction, but that type of thing, that plus other igniting factors.
Okay. There's actually, I hadn't thought about this until I heard you talk about Jane Austen, but actually a movie that my wife and I really, really like a lot It's called Ever After with Drew Barrymore.
Oh, yeah, I've seen that too.
Oh, it's wonderful. It's a
It's
wonderful
a
movie.
Cinderella remake. Yes.
Yes, Cinderella. Yes, exactly.
Yes.
But that's exactly what happens in that movie. They are
Yes.
struggling to hold
Yes.
on to their tiny bit of land, and I never thought. And actually, she marries the prince, saving the
Yes.
family.
Yes.
And it's actually, I never considered it from that point of view. It's that it is struggling to remain at least, in the aristocracy itself, and avoiding becoming what we currently call, impoverished, or real poverty.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. I'm surprised at how quickly this is going. Okay. Well, I can come up with some specific questions, but before I do, you have 7 lectures on this, plus,
Oh, yes.
not just the 7 lectures. You also have a summary. You also have the methodology. You also have your written summary. So
Yes.
let me just open it up to you. Is there something, let me just open it up to you. Is there another thing that you would like to bring up about this? We have plenty of time.
Yeah, sure. There are some things that basically, in the search for knowledge, I found that the idea of Michel Foucault, that we need to look at the source of ideas. So basically, we are trained, at least in the educational that I received, we were trained to think in terms of true and false. Here is an idea. Who had this idea, why they did have it, are not the questions of primary interest. Question of primary interest is this idea true or is it false? So this is a very bad way to think about things, and because it's ahistorical, as you know, one of the major complaints against neoclassical theory is that it is ahistorical, and MMT does attempt to remedy this a little bit, but at least the in the sense that, well, MMT goes into the institutional structure of money currently, but it does not really discuss the evolution. How did we come to this system? And that, I think, is a defect. And basically, looking at the history of ideas is a very powerful means for understanding how we got to where we are. And so, in that sense, any conventional economics completely, and not only do they not study history, but they also say that studying history is useless. There's no point in it, because what happened in the past is not relevant to learning about truths, and that's completely false. So, in that sense, history is of extreme importance. This idea itself is suppressed in conventional approaches to knowledge. And one of the greatest contributions of 20th century was Thomas Kuhn on the structure of scientific revolutions, which basically looked at how science has evolved and then came up with some rather surprising insights about the nature of science. Similarly, if we take the current system of capitalism as a given and try to understand it, that will lead to some insights. But when we study how this system came into being, that leads to a radically different set of insights, because basically you look at the system from an external perspective instead of looking at it from the inside. And that really gives you massive amount of insights which are simply not available to those who are participants in the system. And so that, I think, is the importance of Polanyi. Also, Polanyi got there first. I mean, if I was to go and look at the history, I would never get to this place where Polanyi achieved. I mean, he actually is able to stand outside the streams of history
Okay, a follow-up with that is, who specifically today don't want history and society and institutions studied?
Well, basically, I think this is part of Polanyi's message. He says that the market wants to strip people of their identity, of their history, of their society, and turn them into human resources, sort of interchangeable parts for use in the machine for production. If you know your history, then you have a broader sense of who you are and a vision for the future and a perspective on working together collectively for larger goals. All of these things are lost when you don't study history. So capitalism very strongly doesn't want us to focus on history. It wants us to focus on the imaginary. Speaking of movies, I think that Matrix is another one, and that's actually very very strongly representative of what is happening to us. We are being trained to live in a fantasy world, and the reality is that we are just parts producing energy for the capitalist machine. I think that artists have a much better, artists and literature people have a much better sense of what the world is moving at a deeper level than the average person can understand or express.
Okay, I'd like to do one more, a bigger question and a smaller question, and then let's get to my original final question. And that is, I'll give you the small one first. Can you briefly, you kind of touched on this by saying, capitalism, whatever, those that benefit from capitalism don't want you to look at history because it's inconvenient for them. And that you have a paper about Polanyi's methodology, which is kind of common sense, but it's just basically Polanyi makes it clear, or you can't separate history from economics from a whole bunch of things. Can you address that?
Oh, yes, yes. This is, I think, crucial, and this is the fatal flaw at the heart of Western social science, that they treat the human experience as an external object. You see, in science, we study the world out there and we don't interact with it. I mean, what I wish to do, if I say that the gravity is 9.7 meters per second squared, but I wish it was higher or it was lower, that just doesn't make any sense. But when it comes to history, human beings, our ideas, our visions, our goals shape history. So if we want to understand economic theory, then we have to study this two-way causation, which I call entanglement. Um, History, as it happens, affects us, and we want to try to manipulate. We want to try to change things. Then we have to understand the historical processes unfolding around us, so that we can control them, shape them. We have to understand what are the forces which are driving change, and so to do that, it always requires going beyond X happened and then Y happened. You have to guess at the hidden causes which are driving things. And those are the theories that we have. Now, once you have a theory in hand, it may be a very bad theory, but it gives you a line of action. So when a group of people adopt a theory, they don't normally look at whether the theory is true or not. What they look at is how this theory protects their interests. And if the theory is good for them, in the sense that taking actions, policy actions based on this theory will help their group, will strengthen the group, then they go for this theory and they say, this is the correct theory which explains what's happening around us, and therefore we must act in such and such a way. Other groups have their own theories. So, but now, what happens in history as a result of this is a consequence of this battle between different kinds of theories. To give a very concrete and specific example, this is discussed by Atif Mia and Amir Sufi in their book called The House of Debt. They say that when the financial crisis occurred, there were two competing theories about why it happened and what was necessary to do to save the system. One theory which they offer is that it happened due to excessive household debt. And so the solution to the problem was to give emergency loans to all households with mortgages who could not pay their mortgages. The other loan was that the problem was the collapse of the financial system and the liquidity crunch that would result. And this asked for bailing out the financial system. If instead of bailing out the financial system, which had caused this crisis, the mortgagers had been bailed out, the amount of bailout required would have been substantially less, in the billions instead of in the trillions. And also, the Great Recession which followed would have been averted. But this theory was not adopted because it did not favor the interests of the rich. And so, what happened in history was that there was this battle of two theories, and the theory which won was not the right theory, but the theory which won was the one which was used in conducting policy, and therefore that theory prevailed and it shaped the policy response. We try to understand history, we try to shape history by the way of theories. Our theories then shape history, and history shapes the theories. So this is the what I call entanglement.
Okay, good. Okay, so a final question before my original final question is the following. There's the idea that government is bad, anti-government, that the government can do nothing except for interfere with the free market. So the idea is that government, just get government out of our way. Reagan government is the problem. The problem is more government. We are the problem. I'm president to get them out of your way. So the idea is that the market is inherently a bad thing, but the reality is that those on top do not think the government is a bad thing. They think it is a bad thing when it tries to help the people, and that they want the government to be very powerful. They want it to be powerful for them. And also, Polanyi points this out, that a self-regulating market actually requires more government because it is necessary to suppress those who express displeasure with being so badly exploited by the market. So that a self-regulating market actually requires more government in order to suppress the uprising of those who suffer because of the self-regulating market. So,
Absolutely. I think this is a brilliant insight of Polanyi, and it can be verified by the experience of Chile, where Milton Friedman himself went to advise the General Pinochet. And basically, the free market was inflicted a massive amount of damage to a massive portion of the population. And there was no way that the unrest could have been managed except by really brutal and ruthless dictatorial policies. So basically, the market unrest creates damages society, and somehow or the other, basically, capitalism is about managing the unrest that will be created by the free market or the unregulated market. And uh, in the USA, a rather different route has been taken to manage the unrest. One is to divorce people from history so they don't realize what is happening to them and the historical process. The other is to divorce people from each other, break down the society. There is no such thing as society. You're all alone, you're all individuals. You should struggle on your own and compete with others instead of forming bonds, social bonds, and creating groups which have the potential of toppling society. And in providing you with entertainment to keep you busy so that you don't think about the bigger problems, that the collective problems. You think about your own personal problems, but never about the society as a whole. And you are told that only dupes worry about others, only stupid people sacrifice their lives for greater causes. And so basically, all forms of collective effort are discouraged and made extremely difficult.
can you talk about that anti-government, the anti-government sentiment is enormous, and in my speculation, that those who benefit from anti-government sentiment are those who cause the government to needlessly and purposefully act terribly, meaning the rich are sabotaging the government, which causes people to feel anti-government sentiment that they can't do anything right. And so they run to those who sabotage the government. They run to the rich. They run to the private market. Let's have more free market, but they're the ones behind the scenes sabotaging the government.
Absolutely. I think they're no longer behind the scenes. The government is in the pockets of the multimillionaire corporations, and most of the congressmen are millionaires themselves. And democracy, the concept of democracy, is just such a open sham that it's a joke. It's really pathetic. On any movement, on any point where the majority sentiment is against that of the corporations, the majority will lose, and the corporations will win. And so the idea of the evil government is very, very selectively applied. The government is not evil when it provides $1 trillion bailout to the corporations, but it will become evil if it provides $1 billion bailout to the mortgagers. So the government is not supposed to help the people, it's only supposed to help the wealthy. So this is just very, very crude propaganda, but seems to be sufficient.
But okay, so the part that really confuses me is that average people buy into this. And what I mean by that is there is a huge element of protecting privilege. And like, for example, Biden. We can't afford 4 more years of Trump, so we have to vote for Biden. Okay, great. Now we have Biden. Now what? The only advantages that I see is that we have, we don't have stupid tweets at 3 a.m. and it's there I see people as protecting privilege, that those who wanted Biden are now not speaking out against Biden because they're stable enough. And, in a way, it's kind of like, how dare you, we're ignoring those at the bottom. But in another sense, it's that is what's required. This system requires hurting others in order to genuinely do what's best for yourself. It is impossible to do what is genuinely best for you and your family without hurting others. And I actually am kind of gaining a little bit of sympathy for those who protect our privilege, because I think that is kind of that's their way of doing it. And that it's impossible to help the poor without hurting me, which is the taxpayer myth. I say I want to help the poor, but really I kind of don't want to help the poor because that would hurt me. They falsely believe that. So can you address that same point of anti-government, that it is reinforced by average people, even though it's so blatantly obvious?
Yes, that's right. Basically, a lot of illusions have to be manufactured, and people have. Marx said this, that the capitalism exploits laborers not by force, but by making the laborers believe that their own exploitation is a necessary part of the system and is essential to give, and that gives the best possible results. So basically, brainwashing people into thinking that uh, whatever is happening to them is the best possible, and that they're living in the great society and the America the beautiful. All of these illusions are necessary to allow this extremely ugly system to survive. And so the capitalists have become really experts at creating this matrix type illusion, which keeps the people fed on fantasies while the reality is starkly different. The particular myths be in use, like the government is bad or the government is good, these don't really matter. But the illusion of democracy and Biden versus Trump, etc., Tweedledum versus Tweedledee, this is
Tweedledum versus
all
Tweedledummer.
dumber. Yes, that's
That's credit to Robin Williams for that.
I see. That's good. I haven't heard that before, but that's essential part of the strategy, that the people are deluded into think that we are voting, so we are actually making the choices when they actually don't have any choices. It's heads you lose and tails I win. That's the kind of choice that people are being offered, but they're happy to flip the coin anyway. They think that they have a choice when they really don't. And so this illusion is an important part of keeping the people pacified and happy with this system.
Yeah, and it's what is most upsetting related to those those average people who basically defend Biden, but then when he's in office, they don't question anything that he does or doesn't do, like with climate change and whatever. Is that they provide healthcare for all is very important to them, and they have elected a really, really nice, personally nice congressman who his primary thing was healthcare for all. And now it's 4 years after he first said healthcare for all in his campaign, and now he's worried about inflation for healthcare for all, and yet these people still love this guy, and I see this as a manifestation of that. Okay, let's go to my final original question, and that is, we can always change our path, but on the path that we are on, it's pretty bad. And I think I've heard you say in one of your Polanyi lectures in 2050, are we going to be here at all? And,
Yes.
or at least, those of us that are not the oligarchs, are we going to be here at all? And it has been something that I've been really thinking about, is how to be a parent I have a 12 and 15-year-old boys, and I was brought up of don't question. I remember asking about a walking bridge. Well, what if it falls or whatever, and I was told that walking bridge will never fall because it was designed by people who would never allow it to fall.
Right.
I remember being in a car we went to a lumber yard, and there was a huge piece of lumber right next to my head in the car. And I was worried, and I said something, and I was told, I promise you that I will not get into an accident. And it's just like, don't question things. Don't worry your pretty little head. Basically, shut up and take what you can get and keep your head down. And I don't want that for my boys. I want them to be kids, but I want to balance. I want to balance allowing them to be kids, but knowing that they're essentially walking into a buzzsaw. And the second half of their lives, I think as best as I understand, is going to be filled with violence and unprecedented instability. So I would like to ask you, number one, am I correct? Or how, correct, we can't say for sure, but given our current path, how realistic is my speculation of what we should be anticipating in the next, 20, 30 years? And then after that, I would like to ask you of what would you say as a parent to 12 and 15-year-old boys to give them a realistic sense of what to expect without, destroying their childhood, basically, of, scaring them out of a childhood.
Yes. Well, I think that if you look at the new evolutionary theory, you find that this idea of survival of the fittest has been radically modified. Basically, in harsh environments, it takes a lot of cooperation to succeed. And this idea, there were some very interesting experiments. I think there's somebody called Ed Wilson, who is the leading new Darwinian. And basically, so if we are facing a harsh environment, which is going to happen, then if we want to survive, it's not going to be each man for himself. That doesn't work in a harsh environment. In a harsh environment, it takes a lot of cooperation to survive. So exactly the opposite strategy is needed. How do we build teams? How do we build friends? How do we socialize? This is what the skill that needs to be taught. But of course, if you take theoretical game theory, then you find that people who you have to have both the ability to cooperate and the ability to punish defections from cooperative behavior. These two are essential to building up a group. You can't be all nice, turn the other cheek all the time, but you should presume that other people are nice and cooperative until you are betrayed. And when you are betrayed, then you should punish severely the betrayers. And that creates social cohesion. And that's how societies work. I mean, if somebody does something that is antisocial, he can be ostracized, and that's the removed from the society. And so, in terms of teaching children to survive in harsh environments, the thing is not to teach them to be selfish and greedy and look out for their interests against that of others. The teaching that our children need is how to work together in groups to achieve collective goals. Is that?
I mean, that makes sense, but I mean, no, that makes perfect sense. But I'm actually trying to, I don't know, maybe I don't know, maybe you just don't want to address that particular side of it, but yes, that is, I don't know. I kind of want to basically sit my kids down and say, I mean, well, let me ask you first, aside from the kid thing, is my assessment reasonable that, 20
absolutely.
years from now,
I think
whatever?
we are on the brink of a huge catastrophe, and certainly we are not acting in ways that will help the chances of our survival. Jared Diamond, I think, has written a book about how civilizations go extinct because they simply respond to the threats which are well known, obvious, and even the line of action required to counteract them are obvious, but there's just too much inertia, and that's what we see today. The timeline for counteracting disastrous climate change is rapidly running out, and no action is being taken because people are just acting selfishly, not cooperatively. We
Because
just
those on top require fossil fuels in order to
yeah,
stay on top.
right.
I mean, basically, it seems to me that those on top will die in, in the way that we spoke about before with Jane Austen novels of becoming part of the many. Those on
Yeah,
top will die if they don't continue pumping out fossil fuels as fast and as hard as they can. And conversely, for us, if they don't stop pumping out fossil fuels, then we are going to die.
yes,
I mean, it
yes,
really is. I mean, it seems to be that simple.
yes, that's right.
Okay. So yeah, you answered the question of basically how can they cope in that situation.
Yes.
My original question was, what would you say to children to give them an idea of what to expect of basically the incredible hardships, if not, way extreme hardships,
Well, I
but
think
say it in a way that doesn't
I don't
scare
think
them
we
so
should.
badly that they don't continue living their, having
I
a
don't
child.
think we should. We should just tell them that the future is highly uncertain, very bad things can happen, but not dwell on it. But instead, we should work on giving them skills required, like living close to the land, trying to grow food, and so on. I think, and becoming self-sufficient, and those are the kind of skills that we need to develop for the and focusing on living lives of peace and harmony, and living and in the moment, realizing the value of every moment, every precious moment of life that is given to us, treasuring it, cherishing it, and so on. So those are I mean, there are things you can do to make it positive. Just like the end of life training, if you look at people who are at their end of life, how we should deal with them and how we should be them if we are in that position. I think those are the lessons that we need to impart. You should be in peace and harmony with, regardless of whether you're going to die tomorrow.
Okay. All right. That's fair. That's how do you, I mean, whatever. I'm kind of asking the impossible, but whatever. These are my thoughts of, these things that you're recommending of being self-sufficient, basically being self-sufficient, but in a communal sense, in a community
Right,
sense.
right. I think that is good. That is useful. Yani not being one household, but a group of similarly minded people who work together to achieve self-sufficiency with the help of each other. That would be the ideal stance to take at this point, and find some place high in the mountains where you can set up a community.
Right. Well, I mean, that kind of alludes to what I'm thinking, which is, yeah, I agree. Of course, that is what you need to do, but that is in a society where that is, I mean, to say it's frowned upon is, that's against greed, basically. That is
Right.
standing against. So I mean, basically, in order to do what's best, you have to stand against forces that are stopping you from trying to do exactly that. So that
That's
is
true.
the challenge.
That's right. How do I join the Amish? That's the problem.
I'm actually pretty close to the Amish, so
Yes.
it's only like 3-hour drive or 4-hour drive away.
Right. I think that's what I'm recommending.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, we went through everything that I wanted to go through. Is there anything that you would like to close out with? Are there any? What would you like to say before we stop?
Well, there's a Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. So I think that we are living in very interesting times.
Okay, profound ending. Thank you for talking with me. Thanks for doing this.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Music for this show is by RecTech. You can find RecTech on SoundCloud and Spotify at WRECK_TECH. To record Activist MMT, I use the iOS phone app Tape-A-Call Plus for recording phone calls and Zencaster for internet-based recordings. My post-production workflow starts by editing on the iOS app AnyTune Pro Plus, then transferring those timestamps to my Windows desktop. At that point, I crudely process the audio in Audacity and then implement the edits and do all of the final processing in the Reaper digital audio workstation. Activist MMT is hosted by Libsyn, and the video teasers are created with the online Headliner app. Today's part 2 of my two-part conversation with Asad Zaman on the 2001 edition of Karl Polanyi's 1944 book, The Great Transformation. This is also the final part in a larger 4-part series on the book. Parts 1 and 2 are with Jackson Winter. Jackson and I are two smart layperson MMTers trying to come to terms with the depth of what we just read and connecting it to our lives and MMT. Parts 3 and 4 are with Professor Zaman, who is a PhD economist with many lectures, papers, and posts on the topic, all of which you can find in the show notes to Part 1 with Professor Zaman. Part 1 also contains a summary of the book. You think you understand the foundation of our economy and society, but as described in The Great Transformation, there's another foundation beneath it. If you like what you hear, then I hope you might consider becoming a monthly patron of Activist MMT. Patrons have exclusive access to several full-length episodes right now. Patrons also get the opportunity to ask my academic guests questions, including my recent episode with Warren Mosler. They also support the development of my large and growing collection of Learn MMT resources and the course with Professor Zaman. To become a patron, you can start by going to patreon.com/activistmmt. Every little bit helps a little bit, and it all adds up to a lot. Thanks. And now let's get right back to my conversation with Asad Zaman. Enjoy.